I'm here at Oscarsborg, a fortress located in the middle of the Oslo Fjord, essentially the body of water that connects the capital of Norway, Oslo, with the open sea. It's a major trade route, and for hundreds of years it's been one of the most important places in the country to protect, hence the incredible fortress located here. Now, the Oscarsborg and also its massive battery of guns that you can see behind me here were also notable because of the role they played in the opening hours and minutes of the invasion of Norway during the Second World War, and they were seen to one of the most incredible and overlooked moments, the sinking of the German heavy cruiser, the Blücher. In what would become one of the most incredible engagements of the Second World War, the old and outdated guns of the Oscarsborg opened fire on one of the most advanced ships of the German Kreigsmarine. Unbeknownst to the men of the fort, what they had fired upon was in fact the spearhead of a huge German invasion force who intended to seize neutral Norway and its government in a swift and efficient operation. However, these plans would soon end up in tatters. As morning broke on the Oslo Fjord, one of Germany's newest and most advanced ships was sunk. Hundreds were dead or missing, and the plan to quickly capture Norway's capital and government had been foiled. Instead, Norway would fight a staunch resistance to the invasion, resulting in vast, far-reaching ramifications for the rest of the Second World War. I've always been captivated by this story of the Norwegian resistance during the Second World War, but also those opening stages of the invasion of Norway and how differently things could have gone had the guns of Oscarsborg here not opened fire on the invading German force that was making its way down to Oslo. It's an incredible story, and it's one that completely changed the outcome and the development of the Second World War. So this is the story of the sinking of the Blücher, but also how the men of the Oscarsborg here helped win the Second World War. Recounting and researching the story of the Oscarsborg and the Battle of the Drøbak Sound has been one of the largest projects I have ever undertaken. In fact, I went all the way out to Norway just to visit Oscarsborg, and none of it would be possible without thanks to you guys, without my patrons over on Patreon, and without thanks to today's sponsor, which is Ekster. Ekster's whole philosophy is about creating better gear for those on the go, and their wallets have been my loyal companion as I travelled all over Europe this year. I'm very particular about my wallet, and it takes a lot for me to switch, but I've been using this, Ekster's beautiful Parliament bifold wallet in, I think, Italian tan for months now, and I absolutely love it. It's a beautiful design with loads of storage spaces and hidden compartments, and best of all, space for Ekster's amazing multi-tool. Ekster has a range of amazing designs, from leather bifolds to these aluminium card holders, but I think my favourite item is actually these amazing little tracker cards. Not only do they slip into your wallet so you can track and locate them, it actually acts as a remote shutter for your camera. That is the coolest thing ever. So use my code Callum in the link below to get up to 55% off your own Ekster wallet in their Black Friday sale. And thanks again for the support. Now, let's get back to the story of the sinking of the Blücher. Even before the outbreak of the war, British military planners had long seen Scandinavia as a potential theatre of conflict with Germany, whose heavy industry relied on Swedish ore shipped from the Norwegian ice-free port of Narvik. Upon the outbreak of war in September 1939, this issue became all the more pertinent to figures such as Winston Churchill, at that point still only the First Lord of the Admiralty, who argued for intervention against the Narvik exports. By December, the Allies had gone as far as to plan landings in Norway, on paper as part of an expeditionary force to assist Finland in their war against the Soviet Union, but in reality to act as cover for an occupation of Norway and Sweden. The plan was only aborted after Finland sued for peace, but now the German High Command, who had entered the war with no plans for an attack on Scandinavia, began to worry. These fears were all but confirmed during the dramatic Altmark incident, in which the British destroyer HMS Cossack sailed into Norwegian territorial waters and seized the German supply ship, the Altmark, which was transporting Allied prisoners of war back to Germany.
You know the inspiring story, how the destroyer grappled herself to the Altmark and boarded her. The hand-to-hand struggle developed into a sort of rat hunt, with the Germans deserting the ship. All our men were rescued and brought home to a northern port aboard the Cossack.
The incident incensed both the Norwegian government, desperate to protect their neutrality, but also Hitler, who now saw that Britain would never respect Norwegian neutrality and that Norway's lack of action to stop the Cossack proved that their allegiance lay with the Allies. Already having ordered tentative plans for an intervention against Norway, the Altmark incident so infuriated Hitler that he now ordered planning for a full-blown invasion. Norway and Denmark would now be captured in a quick and overwhelming coordinated invasion over land, sea and air, codenamed Operation Weserübung. The date was set 5:15 a.m. on the 9th of April 1940. On the morning of the 5th of April, in preparation for Operation Weserübung, dozens upon dozens of German ships began to quietly slip out of ports along the Baltic and North Sea coasts, many having just unsealed their top-secret orders, the invasion and occupation of Norway and Denmark. For Norway, the invasion force formed several groups, among them destroyers, support ships, torpedo boats, battleships, submarines, and almost 9,000 troops and equipment, all with delegated targets and landings, and all aimed at important strategic locations along the Norwegian coast. Perhaps most critical, however, was Group 5, codenamed Group Oldenburg, and tasked with the capture of Norway's capital, Oslo, and, most critically, its government, including the monarch King Haakon VII. This force was made up of 8 minesweepers, 3 torpedo boats, 2 armed auxiliary trawlers, the ageing light cruiser the Emden, the newly renamed heavy cruiser Lutzow, and the leader of the group, the brand new heavy cruiser the Blücher. The Blücher had been commissioned on the 20th of September 1939, but had only just been released as fit for service in combat days before the invasion. With an overall length of 205.9 metres, she was the second of the Admiral Hippe-class cruisers and was packed with the latest German Navy technology of the day. Bristling her deck were 8 large 8-inch guns, spread between 4 heavily armoured turrets. Arranged between them was her secondary armament of 12 4.1-inch guns, as well as a potent array of anti-aircraft battery of 12 37mm and 8 20mm anti-aircraft guns. Completing her impressive armament were 2 triple-mounted torpedo tubes located on either side of the ship, and controlling all of these was a vast, complex, interconnected network of rangefinders, calculators, directors, and local control stations with multiple redundancies. While not as heavily armoured as her British or American contemporaries, a thick 80mm armoured belt surrounded the ship, extending above and below the waterline. Her deck, turrets and conning tower were also heavily armoured, and 3 steam turbines gave her a top speed of 32 knots. The Blücher was no doubt a large, capable and heavily armed cruiser, but she was new and her crew untested. The ship had only spent 20 days at sea doing simple trials and testing before leaving for Norway, and the young crew had little experience at sea, let alone war. Her officers were inexperienced and emergency drills, including damage control and action station training, had barely taken place. All 3 cruisers of Group 5 were packed with troops for the invasion, but the Blücher especially would be complemented with hundreds of troops and officials in charge of taking over Oslo in the immediate aftermath of the invasion. Army and Air Force officers and their staff, personnel to run Norwegian mail and broadcasting services, war correspondents and propaganda staff, as well as civilian dock workers still working on the ship. In total, over 880 on top of the Blücher's regular complement of over 1,300 men were packed below decks before the ship departed. On board were also tons of munitions and equipment needed for the disembarking troops, which was hastily stored in magazines, corridors, and on the Blücher's unprotected deck. Leaving from Kiel and passing north through the Danish belts in the morning of the 8th, Group Oldenburg moved stealthily out of sight of the coastline and then turned, now heading for the entrance to the Oslo Fjord. Battle stations were called, lights on the ships were extinguished and portholes sealed. It was a calm night with little wind, and further north the Oslo Fjord was obscured by fog. Operation Weserübung was about to begin, and there would be no going back now. German intelligence on the defences that were to be expected within the Oslo Fjord were patchy and inaccurate, but the planners of Operation Weserübung felt confident in what they perceived to be a weak Norwegian military and an unwillingness to fight. Heavy resistance wasn't expected, and it was hoped that the swift capture of Oslo and its government would result in a rapid capitulation. As the ships of Group 5 passed the opening of the Oslo Fjord, these assumptions were further reinforced. Amazingly, despite multiple sightings and suspicious activity at sea, neither the Allies nor the Norwegians had fully deduced that the Germans were about to invade. By the time more serious reports had arrived and been disseminated to the Norwegian government, all that could be mustered were muddled and ineffective alerts. In the Oslo Fjord, orders were given to extinguish all lighthouses to slow down any potential intruders, and the guard ships patrolling the entrance to the fjord were put on high alert. Admiral Oskar Kummetz, leading Group 5 from the bridge of the Blücher and intercepting these Norwegian orders, took it as a sign that the Norwegians knew an invasion was coming, but their lack of response made him confident that they were not planning to mount a defence. However, they were about to encounter their first sign that the resistance would not be so passive. Pol III was a small requisitioned whaleboat captained by Leif Waffling Olsen and was one of the guard ships patrolling the Oslo Fjord that night. Having heard the call for alert, the crew of the Pol watched in amazement and horror as several huge darkened warships suddenly emerged from the mist in front of them. The tiny Pol, with its single 76mm gun, was now facing down an entire invasion force. The Albatross, one of the group's torpedo boats, immediately ordered the Pol to stop and turn off its radio. The Pol managed to get out a desperate signal: foreign ships incoming at high speed to the nearby headquarters in Tonsberg. In the ensuing confusion, the two ships then collided, with the Pol's strengthened hull opening a hole in the Albatross but disabling the Pol's radio mast. Captain Welding Olsen ordered flares to be fired to warn nearby ships and forts. The Albatross's captain demanded that all signalling stop, or else they would open fire. Welding Olsen, shouting back in German from the small, lightly armed Pol, refused to back down. These were Norwegian waters, and whoever they were, it was they who must stop, or else he would open fire. However, the Albatross's captain was done negotiating. Machine gun fire raked the small guard ship, mortally wounding Welding Olsen. The Pol and her crew surrendered, but the captain, having attempted to evacuate to a life raft with his men and bleeding heavily from multiple gunshot wounds, was too far gone. With his men hauled aboard the Albatross, he drifted off alone aboard the life raft, never to be seen again, and the first casualty of the invasion. Thanks to the brave actions of the Pol III, by now the surrounding forts had realised something was amiss, but a lack of clear orders, communication and trained personnel meant what response did come was too late. In the confusion and fog, the mysterious darkened ships slipped past the guns of the outer Oslo Fjord with little resistance. The Germans, shrugging off the poorly aimed fire from the outer forts, assumed it was simply warning shots. From the bridge of the Blücher, leading the pack, Admiral Kummetz must have felt like Oslo was in his sights. Only one last obstacle lay in their way: the old and outdated guns of the Oscarsborg. Fortifications on the two main islands of the Drøbak Narrows, Sondre Kolmen and Nordre Kolmen, with its strategically important position guarding the entrance to Oslo, date back as far as the 1600s. In the 1840s, its defensive capabilities were greatly expanded, with a huge defensive fort, 2 batteries covering the eastern and western passes, and a large rotunda built to protect the island's harbour. As the decades went on, further batteries and armaments were added to the extensive fortifications, most notably in the 1890s, when a new main battery of 3 Krupp 28cm model 1889 guns were added, and a state-of-the-art torpedo battery built into the eastern side of the northern island. This, combined with the other batteries and minefields located on and around the Drøbak Sound, made the Oscarsborg one of the most sophisticated fortifications found anywhere in Europe by the turn of the century. However, by the 1930s, the Oscarsborg had been neglected, with the priority shifting to forts closer to the entrance of the Oslo Fjord, and leaving the fort with little in the way of modernisation for her guns or defences, especially against the growing threat of aerial attacks. The Oscarsborg's general neglect and lack of preparedness had been highlighted many times by its commander, Birger Eriksen, who had been in charge of the fortress since 1933 and had argued repeatedly for funds to modernise it. Now, near midnight on the night of the 8th of April 1940, and only 6 months from retirement, Eriksen had just received news that an unknown number of ships had slipped past these more advanced outer forts and defences of the Oslo Fjord, and all that stood in their way was now his undermanned and unprepared garrison at Oscarsborg. It was bad timing. Many of the men under his command were merely trainees who had only arrived days previously, and worse still, to make space for the recruits, many trained soldiers at the batteries on the mainland had been sent home. Now, the Oscarsborg's main battery was these huge 28cm guns, ironically made by Krupp in Germany. And while these things were relatively old, they'd been installed in the 1890s, they were no less deadly. The problem was manpower. There wasn't enough men to man all the guns, and the men that were there were not very experienced in manning the guns themselves. Now, Ericsson knew that there was probably not going to be enough time to reload and fire the guns again. He probably had, at best, 1 or 2 or 3 shots, and each one had to hit. So instead of spreading his men out, he focused them on 2 of the main guns and had them loaded and ready to fire. So the only thing that needed to be done was aiming them when those ships did appear. Now, by 3:30 in the morning, still no ships had appeared at any of the search posts in the immediate area. So Ericsson ordered half the men to go on rest. Only 8 minutes later, an urgent message would suddenly reach the fort. Ships had been sighted. At Oscarsborg, the picture was beginning to become more clear. At 4:02 in the morning, a signal station at the outer reaches of the Oscarsborg's defences reported 3 cruisers and 2 small ships passing the station. 15 minutes later, the searchlight of a guard ship in Drøbak harbour illuminated the first darkened ship moving towards them. Now it signalled 5 ships, 1 large in front, 4 following. In their darkened positions around Drøbak and Oscarsborg, the Norwegian men, many of them recruits, trained their guns on the darkened ships and waited nervously. It must have been a somewhat terrifying sight, suddenly seeing the illuminated shape of a massive battleship out there in the water, and possibly more following up behind it. Now, the men of the fort here didn't really know if these were German or British or French battleships, but they did know if they opened fire on them, there would be no going back. Ericsson, however, was firm in his resolve. There would be no warning shots. The ships had been given ample time to turn back. They had already forced their way past the forts further up the Oslo Fjord. Ericsson checked his watch. It was 21 minutes past 4 in the morning, and he ordered the guns to open fire. Standing on the Blücher's bridge, there was an ominous silence in the gathered officers. Dawn was beginning to break, but little could still be seen in the darkness and fog. Other than the single eerie searchlight from the Drøbak harbour that had illuminated them, the Narrows seemed quiet. The Germans must have wondered if this would be all that the Norwegians could muster in resistance. Suddenly, an eruption of flame exploded on the Blücher's port side. A 250-kilogram high-explosive shell fired from one of the Oscarsborg's 28cm guns shot past only metres above the bridge, slamming into the ship's foretop. Had the gun been aimed even a few metres lower, it would have eviscerated the entire command of the invasion group huddled on the bridge. Seconds later, another high-explosive shell crashed into the ship's port side, obliterating the Blücher's hangar bay and aircraft. Before they could register what was happening, the batteries of Kopass and Husvik on the mainland now opened fire on the Blücher's starboard. High on the hills and firing down on the ship from close range, many of the shells passed straight through the Blücher's hull, exploding on the far side. On board, the chaos was immediate and overwhelming. The middle section of the ship was in flames, and ammunition for the landing parties, which had been so carelessly stacked upon the open deck, was now detonating alongside incoming Norwegian shells. The ship flickered and sparked as electrical systems failed, and her guns fired wildly in a desperate attempt to hit back at the concealed Norwegian batteries. Her main guns never had a chance to open fire. Some of the earliest hits severed the engine room and steering telegraphs, leaving the commanders on the bridge unable to communicate. Poorly trained and inexperienced fire control teams and medics mustered in a desperate attempt to stem the chaos, but they were quickly overwhelmed. All the while, deadly close range and accurate fire from the Norwegians continued to pour down upon the ship. If it wasn't obvious before, it was now. War had come to Norway. What had started as a peaceful night on the Oslo Fjord, just like any other, had now descended into a scene of abject chaos. A German battleship was moving down the fjord, covered in flames, firing wildly into the hillsides as both the Oscarsborg and the surrounding batteries rained down gunfire upon her decks. However, she was still doggedly determined to move north, past the Oscarsborg and up to Oslo, where they planned to capture the capital. However, unknown to those on board, the Oscarsborg's most potent and deadly trick still lay up its sleeve, that of its torpedoes. Expertly concealed from view on the north of the two islands lay the Oscarsborg's torpedo battery, installed at the turn of the century and cut sheer into the rock itself. Deep under the ground lay a loading hall and 3 firing channels for the complement of 45cm Whitehead torpedoes. Much like the rest of the Oscarsborg, it was an old and outdated system, but despite being over 40 years old, the weapons, each fitted with a charge of 118 kilograms of TNT, were no less lethal, especially in the hands of experienced operators. In charge of the battery that night was Andreas Andersen, who only a couple of months before, and at the age of 60, had been called out of retirement to take charge of the torpedo battery when the regular commander fell sick. Andersen had previously commanded the battery for decades, and on that night was well prepared with his fellow officers and men. Just before 4:30 a.m, from his position in the torpedo battery's observation bunker, Andersen saw the shape of the Blücher still moving north, smoke and flames billowing around her. Andersen, who had tested and drilled each torpedo hundreds of times in his career, but never expected to ever fire them in anger, calmly watched the ship enter his sights. He turned his firing key, and the 2 aging torpedoes shot towards the brand new German cruiser. On the Blücher, fires were burning all across the deck. Flak guns still fired wildly, looking for targets, and damage control teams desperately tried to repair vital systems. But just as the ship had managed to move past the worst of the gunfire, 2 more massive explosions tore into her port side. The torpedoes had hit close together, instantly flooding large sections of her turbine and boiler rooms and killing scores of men. Yet more pumps and electrical systems failed, lights went out, and communication systems were severed. Within seconds, thousands of litres of water had flooded into her hull, lurching the Blücher to port. However, even as she began to slow, engulfed in flames and drifting north, listless and without power, the commanders on bridge had yet to truly grasp just how serious the situation was. Kumitz, seemingly in a state of shock about what had just happened, deferred to the ship's captain, Heinrich Voldag. Voldag ordered the ship anchored, but the rapidly developing list made even releasing the anchor difficult. The Blücher, which only minutes earlier had been leading the vanguard of Group Oldenburg, one of the newest and most powerful ships of the German Kriegsmarine, was now a burning, mortally wounded hulk. Meanwhile, the Norwegians turned their attention to the other invading ships. The Lützow was struck first, with shells from the Kopas and Hustvik batteries smashing into her main gun turret and crane. Her medical bay was obliterated and machine gun fire raked her deck. It was just as the Lützow had ordered full astern that the 2 torpedoes had struck the Blücher, and, assuming they were mines, the remaining ships of Group Oldenburg, shocked at the horror that had played out in front of them, saw that the passage to Oslo was blocked. As they retreated, the burning silhouette of the Blücher remained ahead of them, now isolated and alone. Not even an hour had passed since the first shots from the Oscarsborg's outdated guns had fired, but on board the Blücher, the end was nigh. By 5 a.m, the boiler and turbine rooms had been abandoned. Poorly trained crews were unable to bring the various fires under control. Power was gone, and extreme mist had developed, and various explosions rocked the ship. The soldiers and other staff, confused and scared and still confined down below decks, having been given no information as to the danger the ship was in, realised too late what was going on. Now they swarmed the deck in a desperate attempt to escape, but many found themselves trapped deep within the listing ship. For those lucky enough to make it on deck, the structure of command had long since collapsed, and few had been trained or drilled on evacuation procedures. There wasn't enough life jackets or rafts, and most men were barely able to swim. Captain Voldag gave the order to abandon ship by 6 a.m, but the prospect of diving into the black, freezing waters of the Norwegian Fjord was not an easy one for those trapped on board. Some attempted to reach the small shoal of islands in the middle of the fjord, others to the mainland, but both were hundreds of metres away. As soldiers, sailors and officers alike desperately struggled to get to shore, save friends or help wounded, the cold water soon overcame many. The last known photo of the ship shows her stern high in the air as it slips under the waves, with hundreds of men still in the water and burning oil igniting on the surface. Soon the Blücher was gone, but not long after, a massive underwater explosion erupted from the ship, killing yet more survivors in the water. Local Norwegians soon came to the rescue of the survivors, but spread along the coastline and stranded in the Narrows, it would be a long time before accurate numbers could be made of who was dead or missing. By the time the sun had risen, some 326 men were dead. Hours earlier, Germany's diplomat to Norway, Kurt Breuer, had been shocked to open an envelope revealing plans for an invasion due to take place in a mere matter of hours. He was to hand over an ultimatum to the Norwegian government by around 4 in the morning, backed up by the warships of Group Oldenburg, who would be by then positioned in Oslo harbour just as airborne troops landed at nearby airfields. However, by now, Brøya nervously eyed an empty harbour. The ships had not appeared, and the actions of the men of the Oscarsborg had thrown the Germans' carefully planned operation into chaos. By now, the alarm had been well and truly raised, and the Norwegian government, the royal family, and the country's crucial gold reserves were being evacuated, just ahead of German invasion forces which were now landing at Oslo's airports. Luftwaffe bombers accompanying the troops to Oslo now spotted the burning wreck of the Blücher. The planes had only intended to fly over the city as a show of force, but now, realising the invasion was not going to plan, began to swoop down upon the Oscarsborg. This incredible footage, captured for German propaganda films, shows an aerial view of the Oscarsborg on the morning of the 9th. Just north of the two islands is the Strait of Water where only hours earlier the Blücher had sunk, and what could possibly still be the remains of fuel and oil sitting on the surface. The same film then shows the dramatic bombing of the Oscarsborg, with huge plumes of smoke being thrown into the sky. With little in the way of anti-aircraft defences, the various wooden buildings and structures in the islands were soon ablaze. But the deep bunkers and fortifications of the Oscarsborg meant the garrison were all but unharmed. Surveying the damage between the brief lull in the bombings, Eriksson now weighed his options. Telephone communication with the mainland had been cut off, and radio reports indicated that Oslo had already been captured. The Oscarsborg was isolated, and with few men and little hope of reinforcements or even communication with the higher chain of command, there seemed to be little more that they could do. Eventually, the German ships tentatively returned, and by 5 o'clock in the afternoon, negotiations had begun. Not wishing to cause further pointless bloodshed and hearing little in the way of orders from command, Eriksson agreed to surrender. The old fort, manned by a skeleton crew of fresh recruits, had managed to sink one of the Kreigsmarine's newest and most fearsome warships, but more importantly, it would have far-reaching ramifications for the rest of the invasion. The Germans' failure to capture Oslo's government and monarch allowed them to escape to Britain, where they would vehemently refuse to recognise any German-installed leadership. This all but solidified the Norwegian public's staunch resistance towards the occupation, an occupation that would drain German resources, with some 300,000 troops tied up throughout the country for the duration of the war. The Allies had, within hours, launched their own counter-operation in Norway, but a combination of poor coordination and the subsequent invasion of France in the Low Countries only weeks later eventually forced their retreat. German victory had come at a high cost, however. While Norway's coastline vastly expanded the Kriegsmarine's ability to operate at sea and threaten Britain, their surface fleet had been all but crippled during the invasion, giving them a vastly diminished force unable to take advantage of Norway's access to the North Sea and effectively ruling out any prospect of a possible seaborne invasion of the British Isles. Perhaps most critically, however, the fallout from Operation Weserübung and Britain's failure to stop the invasion of Norway would lead to the collapse of Neville Chamberlain's government in a dramatic confrontation in the British Houses of Parliament, an event that would become known as the Norway or Narvik debate. It was here that the Conservative, Liberal and Labour parties now turned to one of the greatest critics of German aggression and the failed policy of appeasement, the man who had long argued for action in Norway and had now been seemingly proven right, Winston Churchill.
At the critical moment and out of crisis, Britain gets the war Prime Minister of her desire. Behind Mr. Churchill, the country rallies solidly and resolutely to the task of defeating the most sinister madman that ever aspired to world conquest. The man to beat Hitler is Winston Churchill.
Well, thank you very much for watching what is a big subject. It took me a while to pull together. I mentioned at the start, this is definitely one of the most involved projects I have undertaken this year, not least of which because we actually went to Norway to visit the Oscarsborg in person. I wanted to get a better understanding of the place, and I thought it would be good to film around the island as well too. In the end, I actually ended up making a lot more of the animated battle maps that you might have seen, rather than using footage that I filmed on the island. But what an experience it was to actually go there. Of course, it's not far from Oslo. You can get the ferry out there. It's like a big open-air museum park now. There's a marina. In the summer, I imagine it's a lot busier than when we went there. We went there in October. And the best thing of all is they have a hotel on the island with a restaurant. And we stayed the night there, and there was no one else there. It was just us. It was just us in the restaurant, just us there in the morning. I think it was just us staying in the hotel. Absolutely incredible experience, and we basically had the whole island to ourselves to explore and for me to research and film all my little bits to camera in front of as well too. I've always thought the invasion of Norway, I think, you know, a lot of us would agree, if you're into the Second World War, it tends to be the most overlooked element, or one of the most overlooked elements of the war in Europe, shall we say. And of course, it's the place where British and German troops fought for the first time since the First World War. The ramifications of the Narvik debate completely changed the makeup of the British government. It installed Winston Churchill, and of course the ramifications of that are, you know, hard probably for us to comprehend. So I've always thought it's an amazing subject to cover, and I always thought as well, you know, when you really zoom in on the invasion of Norway, what could have gone differently had the guns of the Oscarsborg not opened fire? Had the Germans essentially captured the Norwegian government, the king, they had then a legitimized, government in place there. It might have completely changed the way that Norway was utilized during the war. It's one of the things that I mentioned, is that the Germans really underutilized the fact that they had all of these naval bases and air bases that they could use to attack Britain. They were used, but of course the amount of losses that the Kreigsmarine took basically broke its back, and made it basically unviable for them to operate at sea. So it was sort of a Pyrrhic victory, I suppose, as they would call it. But yeah, an amazing subject. It's actually one that's covered really well in one of my favourite war films. There's an amazing film called The King's Choice, not The King's Speech. Came out around the same time, so I think it probably confuses people, but it's a Norwegian war drama all about basically King Haakon and his family trying to escape from Oslo during the German invasion. Of course, the Germans were desperate to capture these guys. There was basically a special task force set up to kill or capture the Norwegian government and the monarch to help, again, legitimize a puppet government installed by Norway. And of course, it didn't work. The Norwegians refused to accept the Quisling regime that was installed afterwards. And it's an amazing film that tells that story and the trials and tribulations of King Haakon as he kind of wrestles with this idea of abandoning the country, or should he give in to the German demands. One of the most fascinating elements of this whole story is that Kurt Breuer, the Norwegian or the German diplomat to Norway, basically chased King Haakon down as they were fleeing the country, basically to beg him to stay or legitimize the German occupation. It's a bizarre story, and that film has probably the best depiction of the Battle of, it's the only depiction I imagine on film of the Battle of the Drøbak Sound. It's, in my opinion, if not the best naval battle committed to film, one of the best battles committed to film. It's incredibly accurate. It captures perfectly the atmosphere, not just of the actual night there, but that idea of who are we fighting on? What are we doing? There's an amazing moment where Sodem, the second in command, asks Eriksson, like, you know, what if we're wrong? You know, what do we do? And Eriksson has this great kind of stoic thing of, he just kind of looks at him and goes like, don't worry about it. But that's kind of, it really captures that element of what they were dealing with on that night. And it's an amazing film. I'd recommend watching it. I'd like to have talked about it more in the actual video. I didn't really get a chance to. I will say I might make another video just on that film scene. You guys might not know, but I actually have another channel called Film Things. Now, I've only uploaded like one video to that channel, but I like to talk more about film, and I'd like to make a video about The King's Choice. So if you're interested in this subject and hearing me talk more, you can maybe go to that channel as well, and I'll try and get something made up at some time about that. I don't know when I'm going to do that, but it may happen at some point in the future. Before I go, a couple of recommendations. If you're interested in this subject, I cannot recommend this book enough. It's called The Sinking of the Blücher, The Battle of the Drøbak Sound. I believe this book only came out maybe this year or late last year. It's a very new publication. Incredible book. Really tells you a lot about the different elements of the invasion and what led to the invasion. I think one of the most fascinating elements of all this is that, you know, contrary to popular belief, I think, the Germans didn't have a plan to invade Norway. It was never part of their plan. It was done because basically Hitler became convinced that the British were going to invade. And what's funny is the British were planning to do that, or at the very least, Winston Churchill was desperate to do it. You know, so the story of all of that and the kind of the conflicting kind of ideas and paranoia that led to the invasion is truly amazing. And this book, it tells it fantastically. The other one is called Doomed Before the Start, the Allied Intervention in Norway, 1940, Volume 1, The Road to Invasion and Early Moves. It's it's a bit of a mouthful, that one, but it's very good as well too, as the setup and just giving you a wider idea rather than just the kind of elements in the Oslo Fjord that night on the April 9th. But yeah, that's about it. Big video. I'm glad it's over because I've been wanting to tell this story for a while, and I've never done so many animations. You may have noticed in this video. It's been really good fun, but it was a bit of a learning curve. It was a lot more than I expected it to be. But I'm going to try and get this finished now and uploaded, hopefully tonight. So if you're watching this on the day that it came up, I recorded this about an hour before you're watching it probably. But yeah, thank you very much for watching, and yeah, bye-bye.